Rockaways Productions presents The Cayce Waters Show, Episode 98, Down the Mountain, and the Edgar Cayce Primer by Herbert Puryear, Ph.D. Hello, I'm your host, Cayce Waters, and today's show features two sections. The first section is titled Down the Mountain. This is fantasy fiction material of my own creation. This deals with a seeker who is seeking a mystical experience and has just that, but now he must relate it to other people. The next section is the Edgar Cayce Primer by Herbert Puryear, Ph.D. This book analyzes Edgar Cayce, his writings, and his attitudes and theories on religion and other things. I will dive into that book later on in the show. But before I start anything, I have a little announcement of sorts. My close friend John Blackwell produces the Mad Scientist Tea Party on URTV here in Asheville, North Carolina. I have been on his show a few times already. Well, John and I decided to co-sponsor each other, so to speak. He will give me a short clip promoting the Mad Scientist Tea Party shortly. It might run on this episode or on an episode in the near future and henceforth. And similarly, I submitted a clip promoting the Cayce Waters Show to John Blackwell for use on the Mad Scientist Tea Party on URTV. The Mad Scientist Tea Party airs at 4 p.m. on Thursday and Friday afternoons. Well, and the Mad Scientist Tea Party features other producers from URTV. So we all kind of work together as a community. Well, this is a new experience for me. I don't really work with other producers in Manhattan since I don't live there. And in Anchorage, when I produced the Cayce Waters Show there, while living there, my cooperation with other producers for GCI Cable was very limited, pretty much non-existent. But here things are taking a different turn as I get a little more involved in other shows, and they get involved in mine. Well, there will be later on in the show background footage from a Mount Dungeon event. Mount Dungeon is another show on URTV produced by Matt Howard. I believe it comes on Thursday nights around 11, but I am unsure. Check the URTV schedule for further information. Mount Dungeon is followed by The Wallpaper Project, produced by Michael Folliott. So, anyway, we have all these shows. And they're good shows. So, let's move on to my show. Okay, here we go. Off we go, or rather, up we go. For this is entitled Down the Mountain. And to get down the mountain, well, you first got to go up the mountain. This is fantasy fiction material of my own creation, dealing with a seeker or subject seeking a mystical experience. So off he or she goes up the mountain. Well, the mountain, the way I picture it, is kind of a gradual mountain of sorts. Nothing unduly steep, and with grasslands and trees on it. Perhaps similar to Mount Kilimanjaro in Africa. But anyway, so the climber, the seeker, starts his or her ascent. However, it's not just a simple ascent, walk up to the top of the mountain, climb to the top of the mountain. No, it is much slower, much more careful, like a nature hike with lots of careful observation of plant life, insect life, animal life, habitats, with lots of meditation along the way. It might take several days to reach the summit. So, after a long, careful, meditative ascent, the seeker finally arrives at the summit and sits down to meditate. And meditates, well, I guess several days. At least several hours. Who knows, maybe even several weeks. After a certain point, realizations of all sorts, inspirations, ideas of possibilities come pouring in to the meditator's mind. Well, what are these notions? Well, they include that telepathy is real. We, in fact, can communicate with each other via telepathy. But it's much more than that. We could use others to help further our goals. In a sense, we would be using God and in cahoots with God, work through others and to realize our goals and God's goals. However, it might not always be that way. See here where the meditator realizes the true complex nature of the situation here. Well, what it is there's a conflict of sorts between good and evil. And it depends what you're up to. If you're working with God, well, I guess you're on the side of good. If you're working for yourself and also against God, well, you're working for evil or against God at the moment. But how does this come about? Well, this comes about is not so much evil traps us, well, maybe it does to a point, but it's mainly our ignorance that is trapping us and causing us to come short of God's glory. Sure, it's all our shortcomings, our pride gets in the way, and also our selfishness and our dualistic thinking. Well, how do we get out of it? Well, we have to focus on love, focus on humility, generosity, and unified thinking. Instead of thinking of everything in terms of me and you, us and them, it's more of we all are one. And that is a unified thinking that comes from love, humility, and generosity. Thinking of me versus you, us versus them, is kind of ignorant thinking that comes from pride, selfishness, and greed. Well, this causes us to work against God. And even if we could use telepathy and work through others to do this, which we might be able to, we're still working against God. And the good forces will rise up and oppress it, curtail it, and reduce it, and eventually eliminate any efforts against God. For in the end, God will emerge victorious. All sentient beings will eventually become enlightened. You betcha. It's just a matter of time. Do you have time to help other sentient beings become enlightened? Well, I guess that's the question, for it will take a long time, and we all need to pitch in. But anyway, so the seekers at the summit, gaining all this awareness. So, what other awareness is there? Well, there's even the possibility of transforming situations or even matter itself, transforming one situation to another. And sometimes, and perhaps much more commonly, the transformation doesn't occur without. No, the transformation occurs within, and we transform and change ourselves, and in turn use this to change others. Well, if we want to, when we see fit, and all for the glory of God, and using God to help us to spread the notion of love and generosity, cooperation, sure, and unified thinking, and many other concepts. But anyway, so the seeker, well, I guess feeling it himself or herself, realizes that it is indeed possible to have a rapid transformation into a powerful, creative being in league with others with similar purpose. Sure, I'm assuming this really does happen, probably more often than I realize. I hope perhaps something like this has happened to you. Well, I guess I felt I was on the way a few times, every once in a while, feeling the potential, certainly, that such an event can occur. And hence, I incorporate it into my story. You betcha. We can, at least according to my belief, transform ourselves, as I said, into a powerful, creative being. And will we be working with others with similar purpose to ours? Except typically we would be unaware of it. See, what it is we are all part of this fantastic mission, but we don't even realize it. That's the sad part. We participated in this fantastic mission throughout our lives, into our distant past, even if we were relatively unenlightened then, through our present as we're gaining spiritual knowledge, and into the future, where hopefully we'll take our spiritual knowledge to new heights and greatness. Anyway, so we have to keep that in mind. We are really part of this fantastic mission. For, according to Edgar Cayce, whom I have many things in common with as far as philosophical outlook, Well, Edgar Cayce says the mind is one of the most powerful things in the whole universe. Well, that goes in accordance with my notion of the imaginary territories and their extreme power and influence, and that we are in fact a part of them. For we use our mind to go off to the imaginary territories of thought, to new ideas of morality, and ideas such as rapidly transforming ourselves and other ideas. Sure, we all work together and our mind is powerful. So, now comes the problem. Well, what is the problem? Well, at least according to my story, and remember, this is just a story. But anyway, the seekers on top of the mountain and gained all this knowledge, much more than I described. Why? Well, the seeker knows it was much more. Well, why couldn't he have gotten it to us? Well, that's the problem. Shortly after the vision, it was like waking up from a dream. The memory of it quickly began to fade. The seeker realized this at once, grabbed his few possessions that he had with him at the summit, and instantly took off down the mountain in a rapid descent, going as fast as he or she can, but still being careful not to harm sentient beings, but certainly wanting to get down the mountain quickly. Unlike the slow, careful, studied ascent, this was a quick, rapid, let's get down the mountain quickly descent. Why? Well, the knowledge was fading from the newfound vision. And even though it was much more expansive than I just relayed, not much more was left than I just relayed, unfortunately. So thus ends the story of Down the Mountain. Now it is time for the Edgar Cayce Primer by Herbert Puryear, PhD. Now it is time for the Edgar Cayce Primer, Discovering the Path to Self-Transformation by Herbert B. Puryear, PhD. So, as I said, Edgar Cayce and I do share a lot of philosophical things in common. The notion of how important it is to work with God and that God can work through us. Also, the power of the mind and how far it could take us and what we truly do, how we influence others and do many other things without realizing it most of the time. This is all part of our great story, and this idea I share with Edgar Cayce. Well, to get a feel for this and so much more, it's probably best just to read from the book. So now, let's go to page 3 of the Edgar Cayce Primer by Herbert Puryear, PhD. In contrast, Edgar Cayce, who is really only one exceptional individual among hundreds who have traveled the mystic path, presented solid evidence that information of every kind may be obtained entirely from within. Then, on page 4, since we are all souls, psychic ability as an attribute of the soul is therefore a potential for everyone. Now, let's move to page 6. The subconscious, which is evident especially in our dreams and spontaneous urgings, acts as a filter or mediator between the infinite potential of the superconscious and the finite limitations of the waking conscious. The concept of the subconscious as a dynamic process between normal physical consciousness and the superconscious potential is the key to a fuller understanding of the array of inner experiences available to us. As a mediator, the subconscious may either enhance or distort man's access to the divine within. Information coming from the superconscious filters through the thought forms and desire patterns of the subconscious. Therefore, it may be accurate or inaccurate, helpful or harmful, pure or distorted. The ability to establish and maintain a helpful input from the superconscious is dependent upon many factors. It is affected by the general physical health and the degree of momentary attunement of the physical body of the channel. It involves the thoughts, emotions, and desires of the channel. It depends on the channel's deep-seated conception of the source he intends to tap. It is influenced by the purposes, motivations, and ideals of the channel. Now let's skip over to page 8. For this reason, among others, Edgar Cayce said that the most important experience for any person was to establish a spiritual ideal. Now, let's go to page 19. We were all created in the beginning as spiritual beings, children of God, born of His desire for companionship, with the potential to become co-creators with Him. As souls, we were given minds with which to build, wills with which to choose, and access to the Spirit, the one great force of the universe. We were perfect from the day of our creation. Then, born of our own pride, a rebellious turn of spirit occurred within us, and we went astray. We made a succession of choices which were not in harmony with universal laws. We built limiting thought patterns with our minds, and by these we enveloped and encased ourselves in lower and lower dimensions of consciousness. Now, let's go to page 38 of the Edgar Cayce Primer, Discovering the Path to Self-Transformation by Herbert B. Puryear, Ph.D. The primary premise of the Edgar Cayce readings is the oneness of all force. The one force is the Spirit of God, and all that we know or experience is a manifestation of that force. A second premise is that we, all mankind, are children of God, and thus spiritual beings. A third given is that the primary condition of being is consciousness, and as a corollary to this, that we are presently projecting into a three-dimensional consciousness. Now, let's go to page 40. Here, on page 40, there's a diagram showing the conscious, the subconscious, and the superconscious. The conscious corresponds to the physical body and is what we typically deal with. The subconscious, more elusive, deals with our mental body and is a link between the conscious and the superconscious, which represents our all-knowing spiritual body that can tap in to the infinite knowledge and potential of God. So, now, let's skip over to page 45. When we turn within, we are initially confronted by our own personal subconscious. However, all subconscious minds are in contact with one another. When we open ourselves without direction to these levels of consciousness, we are sensitive to or even vulnerable to the thoughts of others. As we go deeper, we find levels such as the spirit planes and other planes of consciousness to which we may attune or which we may intrude into our awareness if we are not properly directed. Now, let's go to page 57. The spirit is the life. The mind is the builder. The physical is the result. And on page 58, in the same way, we may learn what someone says about the power of the mind, and yet have little, if any, appreciation of a statement such as that given in the Edgar Cayce readings, namely, that the mind is nearer to being limitless than anything else in the universe. Now, let's go to page 62. Thus, let us try to summarize and restate the condition of man. We were made in God's image. This means not only that there is a pattern of the divine imprinted upon the soul, but also that we are a miniature model of the triune God. This means that we have the opportunity to be co-creators with Him through the Logos, or Christ, within the mind. The mind is a mediator between the spiritual and the physical. Cayce Waters Show. Producer, Cayce Waters. Graphic editing, Judson Laird. Please note our new email address, CayceWaters2@CayceWaters.com.